Are you looking to grow revenues, increase profitability, or obtain financing? If so, you came to the right place.
Running a business is all about leadership. How do you become a better leader? Learn from the successful entrepreneurs and business owners how to lead your organization more effectively. That's why we created Leadership Live at 8:05, Talking Small Business, to help you succeed with your host, Andrew Frazier, Business Growth Pro and CFO and founder of the Small Business Pro University. Every Tuesday evening at 8 p.m. Eastern, we're joined by experienced entrepreneurs and business owners who share their secrets to success via live stream. Also, every Friday morning, we release a new podcast episode. Either way, you will learn about developing your business leadership skills from our roster of highly performing guest experts. Leadership Live is one of the many valuable resources provided through the Small Business Pro University, empowering business owners to learn, profit, and grow. Find out more at sbprou.com.
All right, good evening. Welcome back to Leadership Live at 8:05. I'm your host, Andrew Frazier, and excited to be back once again on Tuesday evening. As you know, there's so many things that you need to know as a business owner that it's impossible to know them all. But just because you don't know something doesn't mean it can't hurt you. But not only that, it's critical to develop your leadership skills because your organization can only go as far as you're prepared to take it. And that's really why we created Leadership Live at 8:05. So, it's about sharing leadership and business knowledge to help you be able to take your business further faster. Each week we have a great guest who has experience, not just business experience, but small business experience, because many times what you do in small business is different than what you do in larger businesses if you want to be successful. So very excited about my guest tonight, John Kennedy. I've known him for many years, and he's run an amazing organization very successfully. And we both have an engineering background, so we look at things from an analytical perspective. And one of the key things about that is really focusing on understanding the challenges before you try to solve them. So tonight's program is called Prescribing Without a Diagnosis is Malpractice. If the doctor prescribes you something but doesn't check you out to make sure it's what you need, then it's malpractice. And in business, that should be the same way, but it isn't always so. So we're going to talk about, how do you get a prescription, but also, what's the benefit and how does this work? So, tonight, look forward to having John Kennedy on. He's retired as CEO of NJMEP, New Jersey Manufacturing Experience Program, where he led the organization and implemented many assessments that have helped a lot of manufacturing businesses throughout the state. So, John, how are you doing this evening?
I'm doing really well, Andrew.
Okay, well, welcome. I'm great. So thanks for taking time out of your busy schedule to hang out with me tonight and share some of your knowledge and experience and expertise.
Well, I always enjoy working with you, and we sometimes share a brain, especially when we're talking about small businesses. So that's a big plus.
Definitely. So, definitely we know each other, but a lot of people in the audience may not know you. So if you could just take a few minutes to kind of just walk a little bit through your journey, because I think that'll give them even more perspective to understand sort of where we're coming from on the topic tonight.
Sure. The reality is most people know me from NJMEP because I spent 12 years there. And, we grew our company into the number one MEP in the country. There's 51 of them. And, a lot of that was engaging with the 11,000 plus manufacturers. About 85% of them are small businesses, so in order to be productive as a country and as a supply chain, you need to be productive as a small business. But the reality is that my background, going back to my start many moons ago, was that, I worked for small and large companies for years. Coleman Equipment in Irvington was one where I got got my going ahead with design engineering and stuff, and learned a lot about that as well as operations. Then for a few years, I was one of the senior managers for Sandvik sorting systems, providing billions of dollars worth of sort systems for DHL, FedEx, UPS, etc., airports. But my real learning experience came from owning my own businesses, owning a manufacturing company, owning an engineering company, because that's where I really wanted to be. I wanted to see if some of these ideas in my head were of value, but I also wanted to grow something from my foundation. And, I had to learn a lot of things. You and I were talking not long ago, Andrew, that, even though, I now have 4 college degrees, which sounds wonderful, but, that doesn't teach you the practical aspects of writing a good, a good business plan, applying a good business plan. My wife and I went to, when we were looking to buy and then expand our engineering company, the Multitech Group, we went through 7 banks, and trying to get them to support us, even though we were a successful business. It was difficult because you've got to make sure that you have that plan. And that falls in line with some of the things that you are bringing up that we've talked about ad nauseum, whether that's assessments for companies. But the reality is that this is what allowed me to be productive at NJMEP. And, while it was the ending of my full-time career, I'm still doing some consulting. It certainly holds a close place in my heart because I got to work with people like you.
You had a great impact there. And, it's always a challenge to lead an organization because, sort of the buck has to stop with you and you got to make all the key decisions, make many key decisions, and a lot of times without full information. But, tonight we're going to talk a little bit about assessments because that helps you to be able to have better and more complete information as a business owner so that you can make more effective decisions. So, before we do that, I just want to take a sec. We run the Small Business Pro University produces the show tonight. Each week we produce Leadership Live at Annual 5, along with doing quite a few other initiatives for entrepreneurs and business owners. So I just wanted to play a short video about the university, just so everybody knows sort of what it is and what we do and how we help business owners. And then I'll be back here talking small business with John Kennedy.
Many small businesses experience low or no revenue growth, and the owners are not making enough money. I founded Small Business Pro University to help you break that cycle by empowering you with greater knowledge and enhanced skills to lead your organization more effectively. Over the past 15 years, I've collaborated with organizations like the Small Business Development Center, Rising Tide Capital, Empower the Village, NJMEP, Rutgers University, and SCORE to work one-on-one with over 1,000 business owners and teach tens of thousands of people about business. My experience includes serving as a naval officer, managing businesses, graduating from MIT, earning an MBA from NYU, and achieving the CFA designation, which has prepared me to accomplish my mission of helping 1,000,008 business owners to sell more, maximize profit, and finance growth by 2028. My vision is to create the ultimate business ecosystem for entrepreneurs. Small Business Pro University empowers entrepreneurs like you to run their businesses more professionally and create sustainable enterprises. We employ my proven proprietary Masterpreneur Playbook framework to guide your journey along the Masterpreneur path and facilitate your Masterpreneur evolution to work on your business and scale faster and easier. Small Business Pro University provides access to valuable resources, partnerships, and relationships that will help you to sell more, maximize profit, and finance growth. Our Masterpreneur initiatives include the Small Business Pro Network, 100+ expert-led multimedia courses, intensive training workshops, Spanish language training, Leadership Live at 8:05 live stream and podcast, in-person Power Breakfast events, and advisory coaching, consulting, and training services.
Okay. Hey, John, welcome back. We're talking small business, and one of the key things we're going to discuss tonight is prescribing without a diagnosis is malpractice. And an important piece of that is the assessment, which is how you figure out your diagnosis. But before we dig into that, John, it's good to level set and make sure everybody's on the same page as far as what is an assessment and what does it mean to do an assessment? Why do we do this?
Well, I go back to my engineering days and I'm a Six Sigma black belt and so on. It is about measurement, and an assessment is a measurement. And you need to be able to do that at various times for various reasons in a business. And what I mean by that is that you got to set a foundation, a ground zero, to build from. And it really doesn't matter what type of business you have or how large your business is. You got to have some idea of where you're going to go. A lot of entrepreneurs, probably myself included, look at some of these things, when we first started, and you just have a great idea and you go running at it. And, it's like managing a project. Well, it is and it isn't. You have to manage schedule, you have to manage people, and you have to manage, the outcomes for things, and that includes a budget. But goes much deeper than that when you're talking about a business. So you've really got to do an in-depth survey to that. At NJMEP, as Andrew, we developed a pretty extensive assessment that we would do at no cost to companies. It was funny how many companies would push back. And I would always say to them, the account managers would be out there. So, they don't want to do it. They don't, And when I spoke to the owners, I said, look, we're acting as a consultant here, and we don't know everything about your business. So if we can't ask you questions and we can't look at an assessment, then we can't help you. It's just that simple. How many of us have sat in our office and had a consultant come in, and within 5 minutes they tell you, I can help your business, I can do this, I can do that. And not to be rude, but that's a lot of BS. So the assessment tool, is very important. To be honest with you, the one you developed that you and I test drove and did some great learning with it. Those are the things that you can apply, and you need to have that. Now, can you use assessments and measurements for other areas? Absolutely, and I did, and I have. But the fact is that if you don't have a baseline, you can't grow. And if you don't have a baseline that can be repeatable in the sense that you can go back and look at it and say, okay, here I am now, then again, it's not a matter of growth. It isn't always how much money you're making, but it is how much money you're keeping. So, the assessment tool is just that. It's a measurement, but it's also foundational in nature.
Okay, so yeah, so definitely, assessment provides valuable information from the beginning. I think, one thing I've found, I'm sure you have as well, is many business owners, one of their greatest fears is numbers and analysis. So many times they haven't really ever assessed their business. And, if you don't use numbers and analysis, you're not really dealing with facts. What you know about your business mostly is assumptions, but making decisions based on assumptions only and can cause problems. You mentioned that a lot of business owners don't necessarily turn down assessments even if there's no cost, but it could have actually helped them a lot. With your assessment, what are the key things that you wanted to bring out through that assessment, and how was it able to help the people that took it?
Well, ours evolved over the years, as you well know, and to be honest with you, sometimes I thought it got too long in a tooth, because you're asking somebody, but you want to have the business basics, what the company is, what they're doing, what their NAICS codes are, where they expect, where's their clientele based, but you also have to get into the involvement, things like I never wanted to do, in the sense that, when we owned the Multitech Group, thank goodness for my wife, because she knew all about, the human resources areas, and, how we needed to provide benefits and health care and all these other things that, to me, I realized they were important, but they didn't resonate with me, on the level that it did her. And thank goodness that was able to have that. So, having an assessment that can draw out these things, are important things, getting into the deep, but how many people you have, how many people you need, what's your growth, projections, how do you expect to get there? Can you hire more people? Is there another way to go around that? And this applies to whether you're, running a deli, a plumber shop, or a machine shop. You've got to have some things that do that. Later on, in the assessment, we get deeper into some of the areas. We, as an NJMEP, would get into more of the facility stuff, because as a manufacturer, facility is very important. Do you have the proper, electrical? Do you have air where compressed air where you need it? Is there a flow to your, tooling, et cetera, and so forth? And then you get into some of more of the basics. What's your product? How much does your product cost to make? Interestingly, and you may have had some of the same experience, Andrew. You talk to somebody and they'd say, well, we're making, 10,000 of these, every month. Okay, that's really great. What does it cost you to make it, and what are you selling it for? And people would come back and say, well, we're losing about a dime, on each one, but we're making it up in volume. And the math guy in my head says, you're not making it up, you're losing more. And this is coming from some people that are extremely bright and so on, but I guess they see a cash flow from it, but the reality is you've either got to rework your process so that it costs you less to make them, or you got to charge more. And sometimes that's very difficult to turn around, especially in a competitive aspect, or depending on who your client is. You know, companies like Walmart are great friends to manufacturers, but they're also putting a lot of pressure. So, you know, the assessment gets you not only to dig deeper and set that baseline, but it also gets you to think about your business. You know, think about your business where you don't want to. And you're right. People don't want to look at numbers all the time. But whether you like it or not, you know, the numbers are important. Not all of them, but the ones that apply to your profitability certainly are important.
So, yeah, so definitely, you know, understanding the difference between your revenues and your profit is key because, you know, if you don't keep an eye on those numbers, bad things can happen to you. But also, you know, what I've found and actually heard somebody's TED talk on was that most entrepreneurs have ADD. So, you know, ADD doesn't work real well with analysis because, you know, you're always thinking about new stuff and moving forward and looking at things. But, you know, sometimes analysis requires you to sit still and, you know, dig deeper into things, which doesn't naturally come to a lot of business owners, but it is very important because, you know, you've got to grow in a structured way, and you can only do that by analyzing what you're doing and, you know, continually making improvements around that. So, you know, so definitely, you know, you've probably seen the same thing, but, you know, I've worked with NJMEP as a resource for many years. And, you know, before I would do any work with clients, rather than tell them what they needed, I would do an assessment that would take, you know, 2 to 4 weeks. You know, they would pay for it, but, you know, it allowed me to tell them many things about their business that they may not even realize. But it also helped me to figure out the root cause of what they need, because many times business owners think they know what they need, but what they think they need isn't really the solution that they need. They're just addressing a symptom of the problem, and that's not going to make the problem go away. So, you know, having a structured assessment, you know, allows to objectively, you know, look at the situation. So definitely, John, you know, you had your team do assessments. You know, you definitely understand assessments inside and out, but sometimes transferring knowledge down to and through a team can be challenging. How were you able to do that and you know, and get people who may not have been used to assessment or looking at businesses or working that way to really you know, embrace it and understand it?
Yeah, that's a difficult step, and you hit the nail on the head with, you know, if your assessment is, what I've found is if your assessment is only with, you know, and depends on the size of the company, you know, a 4 or 5 person firm, you're not going to have much depth. But if you're a manufacturer and you got 20 to 30 people, you know, you've got some people, whether it's a shop manager or, you know, an ops guy or whatever, you can get in different voices, because you're right. A lot of us, I learned this when, you know, hell, I learned this in Catholic school, but I learned it again as a design engineer. You can't check your own work. You just can't. You think you can, but it's amazing how many times you read through something or you go through a drawing and it comes back to you and somebody else looked at it and says, hey, this dimension's wrong, or this is wrong, or that's wrong, or you used the wrong terminology. And it's the same with looking at your business, because, you know, you're sitting in an office and you're saying, oh, our problem is sales. Okay, you know, but is it sales? And when you start talking to the rest of the team. And that was one of the push outs that we tried to do at MEP, was we tried to push hard on our account managers to make sure they got 2, 3, 4, 5, depending on the size of the company, they got input from multiple sources, because that is the important voice. And as you know, 11,000, companies. I think I maxed out at about 60 people at NJMEP. Do the math. That's not a, you can't do everything for a company. And that's why we had what was called the resource team. That resource team included people like you and others, maybe a Lean Six Sigma, expert. Maybe it's, we would have mil spec on soldering or welding or whatever. So, as you know, we wanted to present you, our resource with the best possible background, but we also needed to choose which resource fit. And in order to do that, our assessment was that, that entry level that you could build upon. And, then we look towards people like yourself to take some of those next steps, so that we're really helping a company, instead of, I'm not a big fan of somebody just going in and writing a report. Neither are you. You want to get down and dirty on, what has to happen for success. And, so when you develop tools, they're applicable. And I'm not just saying that to blow smoke. I know that because I've seen what you've done. And it's one of the things, and even turning this towards you a little bit more, Andrew, is that, I always admired that you had a focus on small business, because most of the tools that are developed aren't developed for small businesses. They're developed for large businesses, and then maybe, downsized, but the cost isn't downsized. Or they're developed for small businesses, and then they're bought by a larger company, and then the price and everything else increases. Whereas your focus has remained the same. And that's why I think that you are so effective in taking that input, that knowledge, that assessment, and building on it to bite-sized pieces. Not everybody's going to be an expert. I remember Joe Coleman, who owned the first company I worked for in manufacturing and engineering. He said, well, when you become an owner of a business, you become a half-ass lawyer, a half-ass accountant, because you wear a lot of different hats. And he was right. But you also had to know when you needed to call in somebody to take the next steps. And you can't have, your ego can't be so big that you won't ask for help.
Okay. Excellent. So yeah, definitely we agree with that. We've got some great questions from the audience, comments and questions. So we appreciate everybody with your comments and questions, and keep them coming. Hey, Darren, how you doing? Thanks for joining us. Kelly, John, Elizabeth, Richard, Don, Gerald, Todd, and others. So I want to go to one of the questions that I think is interesting, and want to get your take on it. Is from Daniel, is this concept more important for small businesses or large ones? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think it's important for companies of all size, but I think it's extremely important for companies of small size, because if you've gotten to be larger, the odds are you've already put some of this stuff in place, and you've done. Doesn't mean you shouldn't do additional assessments on facilities or your activities, but as a smaller business, you got to be able to apply something, understanding what's important. I was just speaking at a group of entrepreneurs at an event up in Morris County, and I said, it's amazing how many you don't understand what what type of equipment you might need to go into a business. You're coming out, you're going to be, you just went to county college and you got an entrepreneurship degree. That's great. But you want to go into HVAC, but you're not even sure what equipment you need. Well, damn it, that's something that's important, for that business, so you need to pay attention to things. And that's where setting that baseline, setting that assessment, understanding what your business is. It's not just because you're good at something or that you own a lawnmower and now you can be a landscaper. Yeah, you can cut lawns, but landscaping is a lot more than that. And there's a lot to it that you have to apply to, and then part of that's, things like insurance, things like, how many trucks do you need? How can you, what else can you do in your landscaping business? Oh, in the wintertime, you can plow, there's all sorts of stuff that you have to think about. So if you're not doing any assessing and planning up front, then you're failing yourself. So I do think that it's important for businesses of all size, but especially applicable to smaller ones.
Definitely, I agree. It brings me back to a story that Gene Bahinsky shared about one of his clients who had a landscaping business, and they expanded to do winter snow removal and shoveling, but they didn't really analyze the profitability of their business, and he helped them figure out that they were actually losing money all winter. So they were losing a lot of money. And, he was hiring a lot of people doing a whole bunch of work, but they did all that to really hurt his profitability because he didn't realize it. And that's one thing that assessment can help you do and understand. And large companies, they have departments and areas that their job is to assess where things are.
Yep.
So it's a process, it's a procedure within the company. But as a business owner, unless you institute it, it's probably not going to be within your company. So you're missing out on valuable insights and information that can help you achieve your goals faster and easier, and even more importantly, avoid the alligators in the swamp before they take a chunk out of you and your business. So definitely, it's concept for both every business, and actually just in life, you should always be assessing where your life is and is it going where you want it to be. So, a follow-on question, I think that goes right in line with this is, basically, how do you avoid bias when you're diagnosing problems? Because, definitely, accurate information assessment is key.
Well, I don't think you can. I honestly don't think that the human animal can eliminate all bias. I mean, if you really believe in what you're doing, there's going to be that natural bias. But what you have to be able to do is you have to temper that bias so that you can see the real result. What happens a lot of times to smaller businesses, whether it's a consulting company, a law firm, an accounting firm and stuff, you've got to understand that, it is a business. And sometimes we get into, and I'll be honest, the engineering world, a client will call you up and say, hey, to one of your people and say, hey, I need, 3 more views of these drawings and, 6 extra sheets. And, your project engineer goes, yeah, that's no problem. but you need to then turn around and educate that project engineer that it costs $1,200 a drawing to develop, even taken out of an AutoCAD. So now what are you doing? So now you just gave away, $5,000-$6,000 worth of work. So a winning project became a losing project. The same can happen to a law firm. The same can happen to accountants. And you want to help people because I think that's our natural instinct. But you've got to also realize that you got to pay the rent and you got to eat. And, if you want to grow, you need to add people. And, that's part of the process. And therein lies that bias, is that you have to be able to juggle that. As you know, Andrew, I have a lot of, charitable efforts, what I've done over the years with the Boy Scouts and with Special Olympics, and then my foundation, Team Eagle Foundation, and we've given out over $1 million worth of scholarships and educational grants. But you've also got to realize that it can't, if that's not what you do to pay the rent, then you can't let it take up all of your time. You need to, juggle that. So my bias would be to help people all the time. The reality is that sometimes I got to charge you. And that's not easy.
Yes. So definitely, sometimes that can be hard. I run into that as well, especially when people need some help, and so that's cool. And with that question, I also want to just add to it that having someone independently do an assessment will decrease the bias.
Mm-hmm.
And then
very true.
Yep. And then also having a structured process will decrease the bias. If there's a consistent way that the assessment is done and clearly defined, then that'll reduce the bias as well. Of course, there's never no bias in things, but you can really get a much clearer picture, and then you can also get assessment or views from multiple people or multiple sides that can reduce the bias as well. So so that's always important. But consultants can also assess incorrectly. Not every consultant's created equal. Not everybody has the knowledge and experience for every situation. Sometimes consultants get it wrong. Sometimes business owners get it wrong. But as a business owner, I think every business owner has worked with a coach or a consultant that they didn't have a great experience with. And that makes people tentative about getting help. But, if you don't get help, you're not going to grow. How can people better identify who they should consider working with, and be able to assess whether they're the right fit for them and their organization?
Well, there's a variety of ways. One is, and you're right. Do consultants get it wrong? Yeah, they do. And not all consultants are created equal. But one of the best ways, when I own my businesses, and even today, if I don't know something, I go find somebody that does in my network. Andrew, I've asked you a zillion questions over the years, and vice versa, I think, because we're trying to, find a better way to do something and find a way, but not all consultants fit all aspects. I'm again, that the myriad of consultants that walked into my offices over the years and told me, I can, they're not really listening to me, but they're telling me already what they can fix. And they haven't assessed me. They know nothing about my business, but they're going to help, and all they need. And so you'll see that in some ads, within 20 minutes, I can tell you. And those are the people I shy away from, because if you think that the business that I built, an electrical, supply company that I built, and you're going to come in and within 20 minutes, you're going to know every aspect of my business, then you're not the guy for me, because, you need to learn up and then apply your experience and knowledge. And also sometimes, to me, it's like influencers, I watch, a couple of shows and they're influencers, and it's, teenage girls and boys, telling people how to do this and how to do that. And, if they're making money, good for them. But I look at it as like, okay, experience does count for something. But not everybody's a good teacher. Not everybody's a good consultant. And you need to have some of those skills. You need not only to have the technical skill and the experience, but you also have to be able to convey it properly. And if you can't, if you're just going to dictate at somebody, then you're not a good consultant. So you have to pay attention, and you've got to find the person that fits. And sometimes that's asking your peers and your competitors. There's enough groups around that can help you, but you only get out, what you put into those groups. And some of them are not cheap. That's why, and again, I'm not, you're not paying me. So, but Andrew, that's why I love what you do, because yes, you do it for a business and you charge people, but you do it with the intent to focus on small businesses and understanding what they can afford and what they need. And that's critical. And they, your clients can call you back and say, okay, who would be, the best this, the best that. And you've got enough of a network to turn around and say, well, this is who I suggest you talk to. That's worth its weight. To be able to recommend somebody that can help somebody. So it's everybody that doesn't want to work full time sometimes becomes a consultant. That's sort of how I'm doing it now. So I shouldn't whine, but but you got to pay attention.
Right. And with the influencer piece, I think you hit on an important thing that I want to just expand upon, because actually my son was listening to some influencer who was like 20 years old, and he was like, it doesn't make sense to go to college. And he was trying to tell us it didn't make sense to go to college. I was like, what? So it's important to also understand the experience and perspective of who you're listening to, but also the uniqueness of their situation and your situation. For some people, it may not make sense to go to college, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you fit into that category. But sometimes people who share information that works in certain situations, but don't communicate or don't realize that that's not the solution in all situations, even if they communicate it like it is. So perspective, experience, and just nuances. Like you said, if a company needs help with sales, one company is going to need different type of help with sales than other companies. Right. So there is no one size fits all. So I think that's important.
Was that your son, Andrew 3, that said that?
That wasn't my son. That my only son.
I know him. I'm chasing him down.
when you're young, you don't know what, but it's important to, especially as a business owner, understand that, what they're saying may not be totally wrong, but it may be wrong for you and your situation.
But see, that's the point, and I could wax on, my one of my pet peeves with everything is our workforce development, the way we do these things. And, we tell a kid at 18, choose. And then we tell them at 22, choose again. And then, it's, and all of us evolve, and sometimes, and you're right, at 18, you might not be ready for college. You might not know what you want to do. So don't go out and spend $100,000, hundreds of thousands of dollars. But in my opinion, no job, can you get that's a career-based job without significant training. I was just talking to somebody the other day about welders, and it says, well, they're just, all they're doing is fusing. I like that one. Who is they? Yeah, my mom. That would have been my mom. If they said jump off a bridge, but but it's, welders, the welders that I know that are good, they're metallurgists. Some of the machinists that I've worked, many of the machinists I've worked with are better engineers than most of the engineers I know. Mm-hmm. And so, it's the absurd thing is to look up or down, let's look sideways to people with skills. A skill's a skill. And, but at the same time, maybe you don't want to be a welder forever. Maybe you want to own your own business, or maybe you want to move on to supervisory or something like that. Maybe that's time to go to school and get a degree. So there's a lot of different routes you can take, but it all should be moving forward. But I'm going to chase Andrew down now. You know that.
All right. Well, he's in college, so he's overcome that situation. But
but I can always tease him.
Yes, definitely. So, so now, I think that one other thing that's important to keep in mind, especially nowadays, is so many things are more marketing driven than results driven. And so when you're making choices and hiring people, you have to be able to look through the marketing, because many assessments and questionnaires also are designed to give the answer that they want have come up so they could say that's what you need, even though it's not necessarily an objective or complete assessment of the situation. So any thoughts on kind of how to diagnose or notice that, and not fall for that?
Well, some of it's just common sense. When you look at something, if you're talking about staff and stuff, I think that hyping up a resume is somewhat of an art, but it's gotten a little bit easier because of AI and other situations. But you got to look at it, and you got to pay attention to it. If you got some guy kid that's 22 years old, and they're talking about running a $25 million project for this company or that company, common sense will tell you, that it doesn't necessarily apply, and it doesn't cut the person out of an opportunity, but it's a time for you to ask a question. Say, okay, Joe or Pete, what'd you do on this project? And then most of the times when they start talking, they'll be honest about it, but they're proud of the fact that they were part of it, and they're being told by somebody else that put that on your resume, I always, as an Eagle Scout, I always tell people to put the fact that they're an Eagle Scout on the resume. Mine's still on my resume. But also, that's part of the ability to interview with people. That's very important. I spoke briefly about Joe Coleman, and I remember interviewing with him, and he asked me, he goes, what's your greatest asset? And I told him it's my determination. And he said, what's your biggest, failing? And I said, I'm too stubborn. And he looked at me and he said, they're the same thing. And I said, yeah, okay. I got the job, so it must have worked. But I think you got to pay attention. I mean, hype is hype. But it's up to you as the owner that wants to get things, and you also got to ask for the right things. You can ask somebody for their, what were their courses, their favorite courses, where do they fit in, what types of certifications do they have, and so on and so forth. And if you don't ask those questions, that's on you. It's your business, it's your money. So, it's not as simple as thing as, unfortunately, sometimes we don't have a line of people coming in to work for us, but you got to pay attention because you can lose more money than you make on the wrong hire.
Okay. Definitely. And, one other thing you had mentioned before is, you can always ask people and your network and other people, because, if you're making a decision about something you don't know anything about, what's the likelihood that you're going to make a good decision? And I think a lot of times as business owners, we may make some decisions that we think are good, but we don't. It would have helped if we had talked to some people who knew more about what we were making the decision on.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, think about over the years how many times you and I have shared an article or a book or something, or something that you figured would tweak me and vice versa. And that's what your network should be doing with you. Should be giving you some feedback and get, if you use LinkedIn properly, that's a good thing. If you use it as Facebook, then it's Facebook. But if you use it as a business tool where you're interacting and so on, then it has value, and that's how you grow your network and to be able to reach out to somebody in a shorter period of time.
Okay, excellent. So definitely, an hour seems like it would be a long time, but it really isn't. So we're coming up on the hour, but we've had a lot of great comments and questions, and I want to try and sneak one last question in before we close out. So, and I think this is important, from Dr. Maria Lewis, and not just for education, but just in general, what are skills that people need to better understand, especially in terms of strengths and weaknesses, and what could people who are preparing others to do to help them be more successful and prepared for the environment that's out there.
Well, I'll give a quick shout out to Dr. Maria. Yes, I think that we need to create better pathways with on-ramps and off-ramps and so on, so that we're thinking about careers, because that's what education is all about in the long run. At least that's my opinion. You can disagree with me, but we sent our son to college so that he could get a job and a career, and the learning was great, but everything else. But to answer you, Andrew, is that a lot of this is goes back to some simple things that, I learned from my mother, that I learned from others in business. And that's my beautiful bride in the background right there. She's wandering in. She knows Andrew as well. But, some of it's just something that I'll say is, she would say, pay attention. And she wasn't telling you to listen. She was telling you to pay attention. Pay attention to what's going on. If you have a business, pay attention to where's going on. Find out things. Look at stuff. Go to, there's a lot of, learning, for certifications, but also just pure learning things. And you can't tell everybody that you're so busy and you can't go do anything. You can't go out and you can't learn from others. So you really have to, pay attention and get the greater knowledge that's out there. Your events, everyone that I've ever gone to, not only has it been something that I've learned from, but I've also been able to network. I've always walked away with at least 1 to 2 key new contacts, and that's critical. So as you're developing that business, you've got to be able to, pay attention and to engage. And that's not an easy thing, because we convince ourselves that we're so busy we can't leave the business ever. But you don't get any better. And sometimes you have to increase and develop your skills. So anyway, sort of answered your question, but went off on a tangent.
Okay. All right. Cool. And just to, follow up a little bit, because I think, one of the things having, taught, on college level, but also just in general, I found that critical thinking is a skill that is not being developed the way it could and should be for people. And especially in this day and age, with technology making it easier for you to learn things and figure things out, but not really know them, or not really have to put the level of thought into problem solving and learning how to learn. Definitely making sure people are really learning how to learn, rather than just getting information from that's shared with them, and not really being able to think critically about it or problem solve, because it's not always going to be right for their circumstances. So cool. So definitely we've covered a lot of great stuff. Appreciate you sharing some expertise, but one of the things that I always like to do is have the guests share 3 key takeaways, 3 things that people can take away from the show that are practical and they can start utilizing tomorrow as ways they think about and utilize to move forward more successfully. So John, we talked about a lot of valuable points, but most people can't remember more than 3 things. So if we give them 3 key things to focus on, that'll help make it more actionable as well. So if you can think for a second, I'm going to show a short video, while you're doing that. And then, we'll go from there. So here's a little bit about, something critical for business owners that we're able to really help business owners with now. So, and then we'll come back and hear 3 key takeaways from John.
You risk cash flow, tax, and profitability issues without timely, accurate financial records. Unfortunately, most business owners are not happy with their current bookkeeping situation.
Actually, our bookkeeper kind of left us. He actually got a job.
Many struggle with it themselves or have trouble finding the right help at a reasonable price. Even if you have a bookkeeper, there are often inaccuracies that can cost you money due to their lack of accounting knowledge and experience.
We had a lot of missing holes in our reporting. Things was a little hard to keep track of.
Fortunately, it doesn't have to be that way. That's why I incorporated small business-friendly bookkeeping into our service offerings.
Working with Andrew and Small Business Pro University was a very easy process. They really understood our numbers and our data very quickly and what needed to happen.
We meet you where you are, whether you want to switch to save money or need us to clean up past issues.
Since working with you, we've definitely been able to catch up on a lot of those missing holes and fill those gaps. So from a business standpoint, I'm able to understand my numbers a lot better.
Bringing everything current for tax and compliance purposes.
Along came Andrew Frazier. In a short period of time, they got us up to date, and now we're fine, and they're handling our bookkeeping.
Use the link below to schedule a complimentary discovery session to explore how we can help. www.sbprou.com/discovery. You have everything to gain and nothing to lose by scheduling a complimentary discovery session to explore how we can help at www.sbprou.com/discovery.
Okay. All right. Well, given that tomorrow's April 15th, that was, kind of timely. So if you're out there and you're struggling and you need some help, don't hesitate to reach out. But as we close out the show, John, if you could share 3 key takeaways that that you want people to really focus on based on what we discussed tonight.
Yeah, here's the 3 that stand out to me, for our hour. First of all, when choosing a consultant or pay attention, put efforts into it, do the work, use your network, find the person that fits you. And if it doesn't work, it's okay to cut bait really quickly because it's your business. And choosing the right support mechanism is very important, especially for small businesses. The second thing is going back to what we spoke about in the whole thing is, that diagnosis. Well, how do you get a diagnosis? You do tests. And what are tests? They're assessments and measurements, to your business and to understand. And they could become in all sorts of, you can find assessments for just about everything, but it's better to find an assessment from a company that knows what they're doing. In the case of manufacturing, and I'm not there anymore, but NJMEP is a great resource. And that's, look, I love you, Andrew, because of what you're doing for small businesses, and your new assessment tool is excellent. But once you do it, you can't walk away from it. You've got to pay attention to it. And that's the last thing, because I've used that term, a bunch over the thing, is you really need to pay attention to your business. It's not going to run itself. Even during good times, you can waste a lot of money even when you're busy because you're just throwing people at something or whatever. So you've got to pay attention to what's happening, and you got to pay attention what's happening in the market with your competitors. Look at where they're advertising. Look where, they're getting their bang for the buck. You go to a Rotary Club meeting and it's being sponsored by your main competitor. Well, maybe you ought to think about doing similar things. So that paying attention to things is really important because it's easy to take your eyes off the ball. And once you do that, you hit like the Yankees are. So that's it.
All right. Well, the Yankees used to keep their eye on the ball pretty good back in the day, but definitely, everything changes. But that's so important to, one, make sure you get the right team. And, I always hear people say, hire slow and fire fast. You're not always going to make the right decision, and that's okay. But, recognize that you didn't and own it and make corrective action. So, definitely that's critical. Tests, assessments, measurement are so important because that's the only way you have facts about what's going on in your business. Most other things are assumptions that may or may not be right. But if you measure something, you test something, you assess it, you've actually got real facts, numbers, quantitative information that you can utilize, which may tell you different things than what your qualitative and gut feeling is telling you. So it's important to do that, and then just paying attention, becoming a student of business, especially your business and your industry. So all three of these are things that you can start doing more of starting tomorrow, and they'll definitely be helpful for you and moving forward. So John, thanks so much for taking the time to do this, sharing. We've got your LinkedIn in the chat, so anyone who wants to reach out with John, he's a friendly guy, so I'm sure he'd be glad to accept your LinkedIn request and respond to any questions that you might have. Once again, is there anything you want to share before we close out, John?
No, I just appreciate you having me on, but appreciate the friendship that we've had, both personally and professionally, for many years now, my friend.
Definitely. Thank you. Same here. So, all right. Well, I'm going to close things out. So just hang on for a minute as I do that, and we'll go from there. So everybody, always appreciate you guys tuning in. Thanks for your questions. Thanks for your comments as well. And because what this show is all about, creating value for you. So definitely whatever input that you can have to make it more effective for you, we always appreciate that. Definitely learn some things myself from John. Each week I learn from the guests, and it's important to continually learn. So next week, I'm looking forward to our show as well. We're going to talk about good debt and bad debt and smart funding strategies for small business owners. One thing about many small business owners is you may avoid debt because debt can cause problems, but also if you don't take on debt to do certain things, you're going to put yourself in a difficult position, especially if you're going to try and grow without financing, because it takes cash to grow. So we're going to talk about, debt, what's good debt, what's bad debt, what you should use debt for and can use, and what type of debt you should look at. So looking forward to that next week. I think that'll be very helpful as well. So hopefully you can join us, and we'll get a chance to see you next week. And then always remember that at the end of the day, the more that you know, the faster and more successfully your business is going to grow.
Thank you for listening to Leadership Live at 8:05, Talking Small Business. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and to the podcast on your favorite podcast platform. Leadership Live is one of the many valuable resources provided through the Small Business Pro University, empowering business owners to learn, profit, and grow. Find out more at sbpro.u.com.